He didn't growl, he didn't bark. He simply stood, between the man and the girl who couldn't run. Bran had no voice to cry for help, but he didn't need one. His eyes told the story of war, of loyalty, of pain no one had ever healed. No one moved, no one dared, except her, Clara, 12 years old, paralyzed. Brave enough to believe that love still wins. Brave enough to believe that he remembered her father, even after the fire, the silence, the scars. If you've ever loved a dog like family, if you believe that courage still lives in the broken and the brave, then stand with Clara. Comment. I believe in Bran if you do, and watch till the end. This story will stay with you. The morning light in Willow Bay was as soft as warm milk, filtering through the old lace curtains of Moon and Moss Bookshop, a quaint little place that sat right at the edge of the town square. It was one of those places that didn't just sell books. It sold silence, warmth, and the kind of peace that could only be found between worn pages and the smell of fresh pine. Clara Everly, 7 years old and wiser than most her age, sat by the front window in her pediatric wheelchair. Her thin frame was wrapped in a moss-green cardigan, and her golden-brown curls were braided neatly down her back. The girl had a stillness to her, the kind that comes only after great loss. Since the car accident 2 years ago that took her father's life and her ability to walk, Clara had learned to move through the world quietly, gracefully, like she didn't want to take up more space than she had to. Beside her lay Bran. Bran was a 5-year-old German shepherd with deep black and rich tan fur. Broad-shouldered and lean, his ears always alert, his eyes sharper than a soldier's. Once, he'd served in the K-9 unit in Portland, side by side with Lucas Everly, Clara's father. Now, he was her service dog, and more than that, her guardian, her confidant, the last living link to the man who had once called them both his best boys. Bran wore a custom-fitted vest with the embroidered patch, retired K-9 active service companion. But even without it, his demeanor spoke of discipline and duty. He never barked without cause, never moved without purpose. Even now, lying at Clara's feet, he was not at rest. He was watching. The bell above the shop door jingled. A low rumble, like a distant engine or a brewing storm, came from the distance before it became clear. A motorcycle, black, old, growling, pulled up beside the shop, its rider all leather and thunder. The man who stepped off it was tall, wide-shouldered, and carried himself like someone who had once stood at the edge of something dangerous and never quite stepped back. His name was Ronan Calder. Ronan was in his late 30s, with a mess of dark hair streaked with gray at the temples, a weathered face framed by a scruffy beard, and arms inked with faded tattoos that hinted at a military past. He walked with a heaviness in his boots and an agitation in his shoulders, as if the world around him was just too quiet to trust. PTSD wasn't written on his face, but it hung around him like smoke. The door creaked as he entered. He barely glanced at the bookshelves before his eyes landed on Clara and Bran near the window. Something about the pair, the stillness of the child, the watchful tension in the dog, seemed to grip him. He made his way toward the front counter with deliberate, slow strides. Behind the counter stood a thin, elderly man with a silver goatee and large spectacles balanced at the tip of his nose. Felix Marlin, the bookshop's owner. In his 70s but sharp as ever, Felix was a veteran of a different kind, a man who had once volunteered in rescue missions during the war, helping rehabilitate injured military dogs overseas. He believed books could mend what medicine could not. Felix knew everyone in Willow Bay and said little unless the words mattered. "Coffee?" Felix asked, nodding toward the small bar cart tucked between poetry and politics. Ronan shook his head. "Just passing through." His voice was gravel and cigarette ash. At that moment, Bran's ears perked. Ronan noticed. He chuckled and took a step toward the window, where Clara looked up from her book, Charlotte's Web, well-worn and bookmarked with a feather. "That's a good-looking dog," Ronan said, half to himself. "Shepherd, right?" "Yes, sir," Clara answered, her voice polite but steady. "His name is Bran." "Bran," Ronan repeated, crouching slightly to Bran's eye level. "You a working boy?" Bran's muscles tensed, and his eyes locked onto Ronan's face. He didn't growl, didn't bare his teeth, just stared. Clara's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of her wheelchair. "Please don't touch him," she said. "He's on duty." But Ronan, in that moment, was already somewhere else, his gaze lost not in the child, not in the shop, but in the shadows of memory. That intensity, that stillness in the dog's posture, it reminded him of another shepherd, one he hadn't seen in years. With a sudden, almost careless motion, Ronan reached toward Bran's snout. Not to strike, but in that foolish, impulsive way some men test boundaries, like poking a wound just to feel it again. Bran rose, not with noise, not with aggression, but with complete, calculated intent. He positioned himself between Clara and Ronan in a single, fluid movement, silent as mist, immovable as stone, his body squared, eyes burning into Ronan's. The air in the bookshop changed. Even Felix looked up. "Easy now," Ronan murmured, pulling his hand back. "Didn't mean nothing." A chair creaked softly across the room as a new figure turned from the nonfiction shelf. It was Dr. Juno Park, late 20s, recently relocated from Seattle, the new town vet. She was petite with sharp almond eyes, jet black hair tied in a neat ponytail, and a soft but firm way of speaking that made animals and people alike listen. Dressed in a navy coat flecked with fur, she had stopped by the shop to pick up a book on canine psychology, part of her personal project to integrate trauma therapy and animal care. She didn't say a word at first, just observed. The body language, the trigger, the dog's precision, the man's withdrawn, fractured energy. That man's not just angry, she thought. He's haunted. Ronan stepped back. "Didn't mean no disrespect," he muttered again, less sure this time. Felix cleared his throat gently. "You know," he said, his voice slow and dry like firewood crackling, "sometimes a dog remembers a man more clearly than the man remembers himself." Ronan froze. Clara's eyes widened, not in fear, but recognition. There was something in the man's voice, something distant but familiar, a name on the edge of memory. Bran didn't growl. He didn't need to. His stance said everything. Juno stepped forward then, finally breaking the silence. "It's best not to test a service dog, especially not one who's trained for defense. He's not just guarding her body, you know. He's guarding her world." Ronan turned to leave. "Guess I overstayed my welcome." He walked out without another word, the bell above the door chiming once more behind him. The motorcycle roared back to life and disappeared into the tree-lined road. Inside, silence lingered like smoke. Clara looked at Bran. He had sat back down, but his eyes still watched the door. "Do you think he knew Daddy?" she asked softly, mostly to herself. Felix didn't answer. Instead, he walked over, placed a hand gently on Clara's shoulder, and gave her the kind of look old men give when they know better than to give easy answers. Outside, the sky had turned a little grayer. The rain came softly the next morning, tapping like fingertips on the glass window of the Everly home. Clara sat in the living room, bundled in her fleece blanket, a cup of warm chamomile tea cradled between her palms. Bran lay nearby, his massive form stretched across the braided rug, head resting on his front paws, ears perked even in rest. His coat still held a sheen from his recent brushing, and the faint scar above his shoulder was more visible in the morning light. A raised crescent of skin, long faded but never gone. Eleanor Everly, Clara's maternal grandmother, moved quietly in the kitchen, a woman in her late 60s with silver hair coiled in a loose bun and posture both upright and worn. She was a retired elementary school teacher with soft eyes, gentle hands, and the kind of patience forged through decades of both grief and grace. The death of her daughter and son-in-law had reshaped her life overnight. From teacher to full-time guardian, from lesson plans to leg braces and therapy appointments, she'd adapted, as only love makes possible. Clara waited until the kettle whistled and the clink of spoon on ceramic subsided. Then she asked, not lifting her gaze from Bran, "Gran, where did Bran come from? I mean, before Daddy gave him to me." Eleanor turned slowly, tea towel in hand. "He came from the department's K-9 unit. Your father trained him. They worked together for nearly 3 years. Was he ever in the army? Or deployed?" "No," Eleanor said, taking a seat beside her granddaughter. "But your father was. Before he joined the department, Lucas was part of a rescue team overseas. He didn't talk much about it, but I know that's where he first met dogs like Bran. It's why he trusted them more than most people." Clara nodded slowly, tracing the rim of her mug with one finger. "Do you think that man from the bookstore, the one with the motorcycle, do you think he knew Daddy?" Eleanor hesitated. She hadn't forgotten the man's gaze, the strange pause in his movement, or the way Bran had responded like a soldier remembering an old commander. "It's possible," she said. "But if he did, he didn't say." Clara looked at Bran again. He knew something, Bran did. At that moment, a knock came at the door. It was soft, polite, almost too cautious. Eleanor opened it to find Dr. Juno Park, umbrella folded under one arm, a small leather bag slung over her shoulder. Her dark hair was tucked into a simple wool cap, and her olive-colored coat clung to her petite frame. Her presence was steady, composed, always just enough warmth to be comforting, but never overbearing. "I hope I'm not too early," Juno said. "You mentioned I could stop by to do Bran's checkup." "Of course," Eleanor smiled and stepped aside. "You're always welcome." Inside, Juno knelt beside Bran, who offered a polite wag of his tail and then rolled halfway to one side, allowing access to his belly. He trusted her, though he didn't give that trust easily. Juno spoke softly as she worked, her fingers methodically moving along his ribs and joints. "He's well trained, doesn't flinch at touch, even around old injuries." "Injuries?" Clara asked, wheeling closer. Juno gently lifted Bran's front left leg. "This here," she said, pointing to the raised scar near his shoulder. "That's not from a fall or a dog bite. It's clean. Surgical, likely the result of shrapnel removal. And these," she ran her hand along Bran's chest, "small ridge lines, low scarring, minor lacerations consistent with blast impact. Possibly from an IED or something similar." Clara blinked. "But Bran's never been in war." Juno tilted her head. "Maybe not officially, but someone trained him to survive one." Eleanor's lips pressed into a thin line. "I never asked Lucas about Bran's past, just trusted that he'd chosen right." Juno nodded, finishing her exam and zipping her bag closed. "He's healthy. Heart's strong, hips are good, but the past leaves marks, even if the body heals." Outside, the rain had thinned to a drizzle. Later that afternoon, Clara returned to the bookstore. Felix had invited her back for a special reading session. A tradition on Thursdays for a few of the neighborhood kids, though today it was just Clara. Felix had saved a spot near the fireplace, where the scent of cedar hung faintly in the air. The elderly bookseller wore his usual wool vest and corduroy trousers, his reading glasses dangling from a lanyard. He greeted Clara with a smile, then gestured to the book in his lap. "This," he said, tapping the worn leather cover, "is The Wind's Shadow. Not well known, but one of my favorites." Clara sat quietly beside him, Bran lying at her feet. Felix began reading, his voice low and rhythmic. But halfway through, he paused, closing the book on his thumb. "Did I ever tell you about the dog I met in Italy?" Clara shook her head. "World War II. I was just a boy then. My father was stationed near Naples. One day, a shepherd wandered into our camp, mangy, half-starved, one eye cloudy, but there was something in him. Something like dignity. The soldiers named him Cesare. He didn't bark. He didn't play fetch. He just stayed close. Listened. Watched." "What happened to him?" Clara asked. "One night, there was an ambush. Cesare ran ahead into the woods, barking like mad. That dog saved 10 men's lives. They gave him a medal. Can you believe it? Then he vanished. Like the wind he'd come on." Clara stroked Bran's ears thoughtfully. "Do you think dogs remember those kinds of things, even if they move on?" Felix smiled faintly. "I think they do, but I also think some memories aren't for remembering, they're for carrying." Outside the bookstore, the same growl of a motorcycle echoed faintly in the distance, but it never came closer. That night, Clara wrote a single word in her notebook, right under her drawing of Bran. Axel. The name had come to her suddenly, like wind through pine needles. She didn't know why, but Bran, curled at the foot of her bed, lifted his head when she whispered it. The smell of smoke came before the smoke itself. Thin at first, like burnt toast in another house, but soon unmistakable. It drifted down from the north trailhead, riding the wind between the cedar trees and curling over the lake like warning fingers. It was late afternoon, and the Willow Bay Elementary nature hike, led by Mrs. Pennington, had split into groups to explore different parts of the woods surrounding Clearwater Lake. Clara had insisted on joining the group that took the quieter, shaded path along the eastern ridge. Less traffic, more birds, and easier for Bran to guide her wheelchair on the narrow gravel. Mrs. Pennington, a woman in her 50s with short auburn hair and a voice like a songbird, was one of the few teachers who treated Clara as more than the girl in the chair. She walked with a slight limp, residue from a skiing accident 10 years back, and perhaps that made her softer with pain, more patient with limitation. That day, she let Clara and Bran stay a bit behind the others, trusting the dog's unshakable instincts. Clara had paused to sketch a warbler in her journal when the first wisp of gray curled around the trees ahead. Bran rose instantly, head high, body taut. He didn't bark. He rarely did. But his eyes narrowed. The wind shifted, behind them, crackling. Then the scent hit Clara like a slap. Wood smoke, thick and bitter. Bran barked once, sharp and deep, and Clara felt the vibration through her chest. "Bran?" she asked, voice tight. He pressed his head to her knee, then backed up toward the path they'd come from. That was when she saw the smoke rising beyond the ridge, and heard the wind stutter, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. She tried to turn her chair, but the wheels caught on a root. Bran pulled on the leash harness, steady but firm, trying to guide her back. But the gravel turned to dirt, then to uneven roots and pine needles. A small tree had fallen across part of the path. Clara struggled to push, then gasped as the rear wheel caught and twisted. Panic set in, that quiet kind that spreads faster than flame, the kind that whispered, "You're stuck, and no one knows you're here." Bran stepped forward, growled low, then turned his body sideways to brace against the chair, using his strength to stabilize her. It wasn't enough. Then, from far off, a different sound broke the hush, a distant growl of an engine. It was Ronan. He had taken to riding the back roads since the encounter at Moon and Moss, circling the outskirts of Willow Bay like a satellite, unsure if it wanted to fall or fly. The smoke had drawn him from the road. Fire spoke to something primal in him, something unresolved. He had spent years charging into them, first as a volunteer, then full-time, before his own breakdown had left him more ash than man. But old habits didn't die. They just waited. He saw the flicker of orange through the trees first. Then he heard the bark, short, clipped, authoritative, K9 trained. He cut the engine, dropped the kickstand, and ran. When he broke through the tree line and found her, the smoke had thickened. Clara's cheeks were streaked with soot, eyes wide but unafraid. Bran stood between her and the creeping flames, rigid, ears flat. Ronan didn't hesitate. "We're getting you out of here," he said, crouching low. Clara's voice was scratchy. "We can't move. The wheel's stuck." Ronan glanced at Bran. "Help me," he murmured. Not a command, but a recognition. Together they lifted the chair, pushed it free of the root, and began navigating the path back. Ronan's jacket thrown over Clara's legs, Bran leading ahead like a guide through a battlefield. They emerged from the woods just as sirens began to echo through the trees. Juno's truck pulled up on the gravel beside the lake. She jumped out, her normally composed face pale beneath her dark bangs. She wore jeans and a forest green jacket, her vet's medkit slung over one shoulder. "Clara!" she shouted. The sight that met her, the man, soot-streaked, cradling the girl like something fragile and precious, the dog standing watch like a lion, made her breath catch. Ronan placed Clara gently on a blanket laid by one of the volunteers, then stepped back, arms trembling from more than exertion. Juno knelt beside Clara, checking her vitals, brushing ash from her forehead. "She's okay," she said softly. "Minor smoke inhalation." Bran kept her calm. "Bran," Clara whispered, her voice hoarse. He didn't leave me." Ronan stood a few paces away, fists clenched, eyes red. Not from smoke, Juno thought, but from something older. A new voice broke the moment. "Well, I'll be damned." An older man in a beige windbreaker stepped forward from the gathering crowd. He was in his 70s, tall and narrow, with a sharp jaw and deeply set eyes that still burned with soldiers' discipline. His name was Harold Whitaker, a retired firefighter and regular at Moon and Moss's Thursday Club, a place where veterans and old souls gathered to share coffee and quiet. He squinted at Ronan. "You're Calder's boy. Ronan, isn't it?" Ronan stiffened, his body snapping into something between defense and surprise. "I knew your old man," Harold continued, stepping closer. "Best damn smoke jumper in Oregon. And you, last I heard, you were right behind him till, well..." Ronan didn't respond. He didn't have to. Harold looked at Clara, then Bran. That dog knew who you were before you did, son. Some things never forget. Juno rose and walked toward Ronan. You didn't have to come back, she said quietly, but you did. Ronan shook his head. I didn't know it was her, not really. But when I heard that bark, he looked at Bran. I remember a dog like him. Name was Axel. Saved my life once. Juno tilted her head. Maybe this one came to save it again. He gave a bitter laugh. Don't know if I'm worth saving. You carried her through smoke and fire, she said gently. That counts for something. The firefighters soon had the blaze under control. It had only scorched a quarter acre before containment. Most blamed a careless camper. Others whispered it was just bad luck, dry wind and old trees. But for Clara, something had changed. That night, she drew a picture of Ronan in her journal, roughly sketched, standing beside Bran, smoke curling behind them. Underneath it, she wrote just one sentence. Sometimes the wind brings someone back. The next morning dawned with a stillness that felt fragile, like the quiet before a memory decides whether to rise or stay buried. Clara sat at the small writing desk by her bedroom window, flipping through the worn leather journal that had once belonged to her father. She had discovered it tucked inside an old footlocker in the attic, wrapped in a faded blue t-shirt that still faintly smelled like pine and smoke. Lucas Everly's handwriting was sharp and neat, each word carefully chosen, like a man who respected silence and only broke it when necessary. On the final page, Clara paused. There was a sketch, done in charcoal pencil, the thick lines of a muscular forearm with a tattoo of an eagle clutching a flame, encircled by coordinates and a Latin phrase, Semper Vigilans. Her eyes widened. It was the same tattoo she had seen on Ronan's arm, partially hidden beneath the cuff of his jacket when he had carried her out of the woods. Downstairs, Bran stirred as if sensing her thoughts. He rose and padded silently to the foot of the stairs, ears alert, tail still. Clara closed the journal and wheeled herself toward the sound of bacon sizzling from the kitchen, where Eleanor was humming an old lullaby. Gran, Clara said quietly, do you know anyone named Ronan Calder? Eleanor turned, spatula in hand, her expression shifting. That name? It was in one of your father's letters, I think. They served together once. Why? Clara opened the journal to the drawing and held it up. Eleanor frowned, then gasped. That tattoo. Your father said only the men from his final mission had it, the ones who survived the blast. Clara's voice was steady. Ronan was there. Later that day, she made her way to Moon and Moss. Bran walked beside her, his gait slow and regal, eyes scanning every passerby. At the door, the familiar jingle of the bell announced their arrival. Felix looked up from the counter, where he was cataloging a stack of used nature guides, his thin spectacles perched crookedly on his nose. Clara, he greeted, voice soft as ever, there's something I think you're ready for. He reached beneath the counter and retrieved a small cloth-bound book. It was old, the cover faded, but the spine had been lovingly preserved with a strip of navy tape. On the inside cover was an inscription in her father's handwriting. To Axel, thank you for keeping my promise when I could not. Lucas. Clara's breath caught. Axel? Felix nodded. That was Bran's name when your father first found him, a half-starved shepherd in the rubble of an abandoned compound. He never meant to bring him home, but Axel followed him anyway. Clara turned to Bran, who had already lifted his head at the sound of his old name. Why did he change it? She asked. Some names belong to the war, others to the peace that comes after. At that moment, the bell rang again. Ronan entered, his hair damp from the drizzle outside, jacket slung over one shoulder. He froze when he saw Clara, eyes flicking to Bran, then to Felix. Clara didn't wait. She wheeled forward and lifted the open journal. This is your tattoo, she said. Not a question. Ronan's face tightened. The lines around his mouth drew deeper, and for a long moment he said nothing. Then he nodded. It is. You knew my dad. Yes? Why didn't you tell me? He exhaled, rough and uneven. Because I didn't think I deserved to. Felix stepped back, giving the two space as if understanding this conversation belonged only to them. Clara's voice quivered but didn't break. He wrote about you, said you saved people, that you were brave. Ronan shook his head. Your father saved me. There was a blast. We were clearing a building. He saw the wire too late. He shoved me back. Took the worst of it. Axel, Bran, he dragged me out. I should have gone back. I froze. When I came to, they were gone. Bran stepped forward, placing his head gently on Ronan's thigh. His eyes, usually sharp, were almost forgiving. I thought if I stayed away I couldn't do more harm, Ronan added, his voice cracking. But it looks like I was wrong about that too. Clara didn't answer immediately. Then she held out the book Felix had given her. Dad wanted you to have this back, she said. Or maybe he wanted us to share it. Ronan took it like it was made of glass. Later that afternoon, Juno Park stood beneath the overhang of Willow Bay's modest animal therapy center, watching the gray clouds roll across the hills. She wore her navy scrubs and a loose denim jacket, her clipboard tucked beneath one arm. The center was quiet that day. No appointments until the evening session with the local senior therapy group. She looked up when she heard Ronan's boots on the gravel. He looked more rested than he had the last time she'd seen him. Less like a storm cloud, more like a man chasing sunlight he hadn't yet caught. You came, she said, surprised but not disappointed. You said something about retraining Bran. Not retraining, she corrected. Reconnecting. Trauma works both ways, you know. Dogs absorb what we carry. I want to see how he responds to you in a safe, open environment. Call it co-therapy. Ronan glanced at the open field beside the center. Tall grass, a few tires and obstacles for mobility drills. A place for healing, not obedience. I've never trained a dog who already knows everything, he said. Juno smiled. Then maybe you're just here to remember. A few minutes later, Clara and Eleanor arrived. Clara stayed close to the fence, watching as Ronan and Bran began their session. The shepherd moved with wary grace, always glancing back at Clara as if seeking her permission. Gradually, with soft whistles and open body language, Ronan coaxed him into a game of recall. For the first time, the dog's ears pricked in curiosity, not defense. And when Ronan called, "Axel!" Bran ran to him. Eleanor leaned toward Juno. That was his name once. Juno nodded. Sometimes the old name is what leads you home. As the sky softened into a bruised pink, the air between them felt lighter, like something had broken, not in destruction, but in release. Clara sat with the book her father had signed, now open to a page with a simple drawing of a shepherd's paw print beside a note. To remember is to forgive, and to forgive is the first step back. The town square looked the same that morning. Wooden benches under the elm tree, newspapers stacked outside moon and moss, and the scent of cinnamon from Eleanor's baking drifting through the crisp air. But Clara felt the shift in the wind. Subtle, but undeniable. Something wasn't right. It began with a man standing across the street. He wore a worn brown leather jacket, faded jeans, and boots stained with old oil. His eyes were sharp, too sharp, scanning the bookstore window with a familiarity that sent a chill up Clara's spine. He didn't smile, didn't blink, just watched. Bran noticed him too. The dog stiffened, ears angled back, tail low but alert. Clara gripped her wheels instinctively, heart thudding. When she turned to Eleanor, her grandmother was already watching him through narrowed eyes. That's Miller, Eleanor said quietly. Used to serve with your father. Lucas never spoke of him kindly. Clara had never heard the name, but Bran clearly had. Later that day, Ronan passed by the shop, returning a package Felix had left at the therapy center. His eyes locked on the stranger immediately, his body stiffened like steel. You know him? Clara asked. Ronan's jaw clenched. Yeah, and he doesn't belong here. Ronan turned to walk toward the man, but Felix stepped outside just in time, placing a firm hand on Ronan's shoulder. Not now, the old bookseller said, voice low. Not yet. That evening Miller returned, this time not as a silent observer, but as a shadow inside the bookstore. He browsed without touching, let his eyes wander to the shelves like someone reading secrets off a wall. He stopped near the poetry section, where Clara was sketching quietly. Lucas Anderson's girl, he said with a crooked smile, thought I'd recognize those eyes anywhere. Bran stepped between them. No growl, just presence, solid and still. Miller didn't flinch. Looks like the mutt remembers me too. Felix approached with measured calm. Can I help you, sir? Miller turned slowly, his smile never reaching his eyes. Just paying my respects to old friends and ghosts. He left without buying anything, but the air he left behind felt colder. That night, Clara asked Eleanor to tell her more about Miller. Her grandmother hesitated, then retrieved an old box from the top of the wardrobe. Inside were Lucas's old field notes, a dog tag, and a faded photo of 5 soldiers standing in the Afghan sun. Miller was reckless, Eleanor said softly. Lucas said he was brave, but too angry, too hungry for danger. After the explosion, he blamed your father for surviving. And Ronan? Clara asked. They were in the same unit, but different hearts. The next morning, Juno met Ronan at the clinic with files in her hands. She had requested access to his military evaluation report, unsure why until now. She handed it to him without speaking. He read silently. The words blurred slightly, though he remembered every line. Subject exhibits signs of acute PTSD, unstable under extreme stress, but loyal, brave, never abandoned post. Why are you showing me this? He asked, voice hard. Because, Juno said softly, I want you to know that I read the whole thing, not just the diagnosis. I read who you were under it. Ronan looked away. That's not who I am now. It could be, she replied, if you let yourself come back. That evening, Moon and Moss hosted a quiet gathering, Veterans Night, Felix called it. Just a few old friends, some young volunteers, and tea that tasted like memory. Stories flowed, some sharp as gunfire, others softened by time. Felix stood near the hearth, reading aloud a letter he had written years ago, but never sent. It was about a boy named Ronan, barely out of high school, who ran into a burning car without hesitation to pull out a screaming child. He didn't wait for orders, Felix said, voice rough with age. Didn't think twice, just went. There was a pause, then a slow murmur of approval from the crowd. Clara sat in the back, watching the room. People weren't cheering, not yet, but something in the room had shifted again, not trust, but maybe the first crack in the wall. Ronan stood near the door, arms crossed, head down. He hadn't spoken all night, but when he looked up, his eyes met Clara's. And this time, she didn't look away. Chapter 6, When Instinct Awakens. The morning after Veterans Night dawned with a hush across Willow Bay. A heavy fog rolled off the lake, blurring the tree lines and softening even the sharpest memories. But for Clara, the unease from the night before had only grown. Miller hadn't returned to the shop, but that didn't bring comfort. Clara had asked Eleanor to walk Bran to the meadow trail by the ridge while she finished breakfast. It was a route they had taken dozens of times, past the old cedar fence and down the gravel path that hugged the edge of the woods. Safe, familiar. But not that day. Miller had been watching. He waited near the bend where the trees grew tight and the road narrowed. No cars, no witnesses. Just him, and the quiet creak of his boots on wet dirt. Clara was alone in her chair, Bran 10 paces ahead, sniffing the trail. She didn't hear Miller approach until he was too close. Well now, he said, voice like rusted wire. Your daddy didn't teach you to be cautious, huh? Bran turned. One glance, and his entire posture changed. Muscles locked, ears back, eyes narrowed like fire behind glass. Miller, Clara whispered, hands tightening on her wheels. Don't! But he stepped forward fast, too fast. Bran lunged. The dog didn't bark. He didn't growl. He threw himself between Clara and Miller, teeth bared in silent fury. The man flinched, but too late. Bran struck his arm, clamping down with precision, holding, not mauling, just holding. Miller screamed. From the ridge, a hiker shouted. Moments later, the sound of boots on gravel echoed, then police sirens cried out from the street below. By the time Officer Jenkins reached them, Miller was on the ground, nursing a torn sleeve in his pride. Bran's mouth was flecked with blood, but his eyes were calm. Clara hadn't moved, except to place her hand gently on Bran's back. Ronan arrived minutes later, his truck barely skidding to a stop. He ran toward them like he already knew what had happened. Are you okay? He asked, dropping to his knees beside Clara. She nodded, pale but composed. Bran leaned into her lap, breathing hard. Juno arrived soon after, still in scrubs. Her face went blank when she saw the blood, the tension, the familiar look of trauma looping in real time. We need to get Bran to the clinic, she said urgently. Now? At Willow Bay Veterinary Center, the waiting room was silent. Ronan paced, fists clenched, shirt stained from carrying Bran inside. Clara sat in her chair, hands trembling only slightly now. Juno emerged from surgery 2 hours later, hair matted, gloves off, face streaked with sweat. "He'll be okay," she said, exhaling. "The bite to Miller's arm cracked a bone, but Brand's shoulder got grazed by something sharp. Could have been a knife. I had to remove some tissue." Clara let out a breath that sounded too big for her small chest. "He saved me," she said. Ronan knelt beside her again. "You saved him too. You kept him calm, focused." Clara looked at him. "You knew he'd protect me." Ronan's voice caught. "I hoped." That night, when the town learned what had happened, they didn't speak in whispers. They spoke in phone calls, in posts on the local community board, in casseroles dropped at Eleanor's door, and handwritten notes on the bookstore steps. They didn't throw a parade, but they believed Clara, and maybe, for the first time, they began to believe Ronan. The next day, Felix stopped by the house carrying a large cardboard box wrapped in red twine. Inside was a bundle of aged fabric, dark, flame-retardant, worn at the elbows. It was a firefighter's jacket. He handed it to Ronan without a word. Ronan stared at it. I don't deserve this." "You didn't take it for glory," Felix said. "You earned it for showing up. That's more than most ever do." Ronan held the coat like it was made of glass. The last time he'd worn one like it, the flames hadn't stayed behind him. They had followed him into every dream. But this one smelled of cedar, of smoke long past. Later that week, Clara asked Ronan something that surprised them both. "Would you help train Bran again? You know, when he's strong enough?" He hesitated, eyes clouding. "You sure that's a good idea?" "You know his scars," she said simply, "because you have them too." From across the porch, Juno nodded, not with pity, but respect. That was how it began. Not with redemption, but with rhythm. Small steps, measured healing. The kind that doesn't roar, but walks quietly. And doesn't leave. Bran's bandages came off 2 weeks after the incident. The scar beneath was clean, still pink along the edges, but healing well. He had resumed short walks with Clara around the garden, his steps slower, more deliberate, but with the same quiet nobility that had marked him since the first day they met. Yet it was the way he looked at Ronan now, no longer as a stranger but as someone remembered, that signaled something deeper had begun to heal. Clara had said nothing in the first few days after the attack. Her sketch pad filled instead with drawings. Bran at rest. Bran mid-leap. Ronan standing in silhouette with Bran behind him, always watchful. Her emotions, once words, now flowed in charcoal strokes and soft graphite shadows. It wasn't until the first real snowfall touched the branches of Willow Bay that she wheeled herself into the bookstore where Ronan stood restocking the new arrival shelf. He turned as the door jingled, eyes weary, expecting another errand from Felix, or perhaps silence. Instead, Clara held out a folded note. He took it slowly, opened it. Inside, in her slanted cursive, were 6 words. "I forgive you. Help us heal." He looked up, and in Clara's eyes he saw no pity, only purpose. Eleanor, watching from behind the cafe counter, exhaled. "Then we start tomorrow," she said. "But you finish what you begin. No leaving halfway. Not again." Ronan gave a slow, deliberate nod. That afternoon, Juno prepared the therapy center. She had moved Bran's rehabilitation sessions to the early mornings, when the world was quiet and the cold air bracing. The indoor training area smelled faintly of cedar wood and antiseptic, clean and focused, like her mind when she was with animals. When Ronan arrived, Bran perked up immediately. He didn't run, didn't bark, but he stepped toward the man with the cautious trust of a soldier, reuniting with a field partner. Juno handed Ronan a rubber resistance band. "We start light, controlled stretches, then walk drills." Ronan nodded, then knelt beside Bran. His touch was confident, practiced, not the hesitant brushes of earlier days. "Okay, buddy, let's remind your muscles who they are." They worked in quiet tandem, Ronan applying the brace, gently guiding Bran's leg through its range, speaking only in calm, even tones. Juno watched from a distance, arms crossed, her gaze softened as she noticed something. The edges of Ronan's mouth twitching upward. It wasn't a grimace. It was a smile. "First time I've seen you look alive while standing still," she said, stepping closer. He didn't turn. "Feels like I'm not trying to outrun the past when I'm with him." Juno leaned against the wooden beam beside him. "Do you fear living again?" his hand stilled on Bran's shoulder. A long breath. "For the first time," he said, "no." Later that evening, Moon and Moss was closed, shutters drawn, chairs upturned, the smell of paper and ink lingering like memory. Felix stood in the center of the shop with a worn brown suitcase at his feet. Clara sat in the reading nook, sketch pad in her lap, puzzled by the sudden invitation. "I'm closing for 3 days," Felix announced, adjusting his suspenders over his green flannel shirt. His hair, white and always slightly tousled, caught the glow of the reading lamps. "Is everything okay?" Clara asked. Felix smiled. "It is. And it's time. I've run this place for nearly 30 years. Sheltered widows in winter, gave coffee to vets who needed silence more than stories. And lately, I've started to think about what it means to leave something behind without really leaving it." He handed Clara a small iron key. "This bookstore doesn't need a new owner. It needs a new heart. I'll still be around, but I want you to begin learning how to keep it beating." Clara blinked. "Me?" "You and a few others like you. Readers, dreamers, people who understand that books don't fix people, but they remind them why they're worth fixing." Tears welled in her eyes, but she nodded. "What if I mess it up?" Felix laughed, rough and warm. "Then the books will forgive you. They always do." The next morning, as snow glazed the trees in silver frost, Ronan arrived early to the therapy center. Juno was already there, brushing out a rescue dog's coat in the grooming stall. She looked up. "You're early." He shrugged. "Didn't sleep. Figured Bran shouldn't either." "Good. He'll need both of you for today's challenge." They worked through new exercises, ramp walks, side steps, agility pulls. Bran moved with increasing confidence, tail wagging slightly, his breathing rhythmic and easy. At the break, Ronan leaned against the kennel door while Juno refilled the water bowl. "I used to think I didn't deserve dogs," he said suddenly. Juno glanced at him. "And now?" "I think maybe I was just waiting for the right one to remind me who I was." That night, Clara sat with Eleanor by the fireplace, holding a letter she hadn't opened yet. It was one she had written to her father months ago, never mailed, never dared to read again. She opened it now. "Dear Dad, I thought the fire took everything, but I think it left something behind, too. A trail. Bran followed it. Ronan did, too. Maybe I'm starting to. I miss you, but I'm not scared anymore." She looked down. Bran was asleep at her feet, his breath steady. Outside, the town was quiet. The people inside were not loud or triumphant, but they had stayed, and they had healed. Together. Willow Bay's Fall Festival had always been more than pumpkins and cider. It was tradition, memory, and quiet celebration rolled into one, a patchwork of townsfolk gathering to honor endings that felt like beginnings. This year, the festival carried a new kind of electricity. Whispers had spread across the village and surrounding hills. Bran would be leading the parade. Clara sat in front of the mirror in her room, cheeks slightly flushed, fingers fussing over the soft maroon shawl draped over her shoulders. Her dress was handmade by Eleanor, a deep forest green with embroidered pine cones along the hem. Bran lay beside her chair, his coat brushed to a soft gleam, his black and tan fur catching the morning light. But it wasn't just any parade for them. Today, Bran would wear the newly awarded Valor K9 medal, a silver badge shaped like a shield, engraved with his name and the date of the incident behind Moon and Moss. The award had arrived by mail 3 days ago, accompanied by a handwritten letter from the Oregon State K9 Rescue Committee. Clara had cried when she read it. Now, as the town square began to fill with neighbors and music, Ronan adjusted the medal on Bran's harness. He wore his old firefighter jacket, the one Felix had given back to him, but it looked different now, worn in, earned. His face had softened these past weeks, his eyes less guarded, his smile something that came without apology. "Ready, soldier?" he asked Bran, who responded with a low, pleased chuff and a nudge to Ronan's hand. Juno arrived shortly after, holding a tray of spiced cider from the bookshop. She wore a rust-colored knit sweater under her windbreaker, dark jeans tucked into hiking boots. Her hair, usually tied up tight for clinic work, now hung in soft waves. There was a new brightness in her expression, a quiet confidence that had grown since she and Ronan had begun working side by side. She handed him a cup. "I still can't believe they asked you to give the opening speech." "I think it's more about Bran," he replied. Maybe, she said, nudging him gently, but you're the one who learned to walk beside him again. As they made their way through the cobbled streets toward the parade route, Felix stepped out of Moon and Moss, now sporting a new sign in the display window, painted in gold lettering over a deep green wooden plaque. Family is where memory is welcomed home. Underneath, the names Clara and company had been added in a careful hand. He locked the door for the day and joined the crowd with his usual slow gait, tweed cap tilted slightly forward to shield his pale blue eyes. He gave Clara a warm nod and tipped his cap toward Bran. Look at you, old boy, still guarding the good ones. Children gathered near the sidewalk, clutching maple leaf crafts and caramel apples. Elderly couples leaned on each other. Firefighters in crisp uniforms formed a respectful line near the courthouse, where the march would begin. A small stage had been erected under the town's oldest tree, a grand maple whose fiery red crown painted the sky above. Mayor Louise Carter, a short, silver-haired woman with a voice that could command a room or calm a storm, approached the microphone. She wore a wool cape in autumn orange and a pin shaped like an open book, a nod to her lifelong support of Moon and Moss. We come together today, she began, to honor not just a dog, but a spirit. Bran reminds us that loyalty is not trained, it's chosen, and that sometimes healing begins not in grand gestures, but in silent acts of standing guard. Clara wheeled up the ramp slowly, Bran by her side. As they reached center stage, the crowd hushed. Bran stood tall, eyes scanning the gathering like he always had, protectively, proudly. Clara took the mic, her voice steady but soft. My dad used to say that real heroes are the ones who don't look for a spotlight. They're just there when it matters. Bran was there for me, Ronan too, so was Juno, and so was this town, even when it didn't know it yet. She paused, smiling down at her dog. Bran's medal may say valor, but it means something more. It means we don't run from pain. We walk through it, together. Applause swelled. Clara turned, bent slightly, and clipped the silver badge onto Bran's vest. The dog stood still, eyes forward, as if aware of the moment's weight. As the parade began, Clara led from the front. Ronan and Juno walked on either side, with Eleanor just behind, waving gently to the crowd. Children tossed leaves like confetti. Veterans saluted. Someone played a slow tune on a harmonica, a song that sounded like home. Later, after the march had wound through town and the bonfire was lit in the square, Ronan found a quiet moment to slip back to the therapy center. Inside, tucked on the counter near the file cabinet, was a fresh notebook. Its leather cover was smooth and untouched, but the first page had been inked with bold, simple handwriting. Dogs and the people I owe. Juno had left it for him. He sat at the desk. Bran curled nearby and began to write. Stories poured from him, of Axel in the dust of Candridge, of the night the blast changed everything, of Lucas's steady hand on his shoulder, of Clara's drawing left on the chair, the day she forgave him. He wrote until the page was full, then flipped to the next. Back at the square, Felix stood by the bookshop, his arm around Eleanor, both of them watching the firelight dance against the storefront window. Inside, the shelves remained unchanged, except for one new section near the back, labeled Letters to the Lost. It was Clara's idea, a space for anonymous notes left by townsfolk to those they'd lost, loved, or simply couldn't speak to anymore. People had begun adding to it every day. As the sky deepened to velvet blue and stars blinked awake, Bran lay with his head on Clara's lap. She stroked his fur gently, her fingers brushing the edges of the metal. Ronan sat beside her, Juno leaning against his shoulder. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Healing, after all, was not about forgetting. It was about remembering together. Some say it was instinct, some call it training, but maybe, just maybe, it was a whisper from God, a whisper that told Bran to stand up, told Clara to trust again, told a broken man to return from the shadows. Because sometimes, miracles don't look like parting seas or burning bushes. Sometimes, they look like a scarred dog who refuses to leave your side, like a child's laughter after silence, like a heart that beats steady again, not in fear, but in hope. If you believe that God still works through the small and the loyal, through the weak made strong, then leave a comment saying, Amen. Share this story with someone who needs light today. And don't forget to subscribe, because more stories like this are waiting. Stories of quiet courage, unspoken prayers, and love that outlives pain. May the Lord bless you and keep you, and may you always be the one who stays when others walk away.